chapter 6, it had never rained before. There had never been any water to fall down out of the heaven. God had created a system whereby there was a mist that came up from the earth and it watered the vegetation. There had never been water to fall out of heaven. But God told Noah, water's going to fall out of heaven and water's going to come up from the earth beneath. I'm going to fill the whole world with water. I'm going to destroy everything that's living, that's on the earth, if it's not in the ark. One man he gave a vision to. Noah acted on that vision. He moved with haste, and he started to build and construct the ark. And for 120 years, Noah built and worked on that ark. And I'm sure he was being brutalized by the local town folk. He's violating the city ordinance. He's violating the building code. You can't build boats in your backyard. I'm sure that his kids were brutalized when they went to school. Here are those stupid kids who are the children of that stupid man who's building that stupid boat in his stupid backyard. But for 120 years, he was faithful to the task. He had the vision, and the vision was based on the prophetic revelation. The vision was based on what God said was going to happen, not based on Noah's experience of what had happened in the past. He believed what God said, so he could see the rain falling out of heaven. He could see the whole earth covered by water, even though it had never happened before. One man. You come to Genesis chapter 11, and you find that after saving Noah's three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, Noah's wife, and Noah's sons' wives, God now repopulates the earth through Noah's seed. And in Genesis chapter 11, we find that man once again decides we don't want God, we don't want the revelation of God. No, we will pull together our collective knowledge and information, our wisdom. We'll build our own tower. We will create a repository to keep our information in because we don't need God. And the Bible says God looked down and says, what in the world has man imagined is hard to do? He's trying to live without me and apart from me. And he thinks if he builds this tower where he can see out into the heavens, collect all of his information and data, predict his own future based on astrology and the horoscope, he can live without me. And by that, in Genesis 11, the whole world only spoke one language. So the Bible says, I told them to be fruitful. God said, I told them to multiply and replenish the earth. So God comes down at this place called Babel. God confuses their language so they cannot communicate with each other. So when communication breaks down, they have to disperse. But rather than destroying them, God goes down in a place called the Ur of the Chaldeans in Mesopotamia. God chooses a pagan idolater, a man by the name of Abram, and he says, Abram, get up, leave your mama, your daddy, and your people, go into a nation that I'm going to show you. I'm going to make a great nation of you. So when God decides to start another movement, he goes and selects one man, Abram. And he makes a promise to Abram that even though he did not have any children, he says to Abram, whose name later became Abraham, he says, I'm going to bless you. Your children are going to be as plentiful as the stars in heaven. They're going to be as plenteous as the sea, as the sand on the seashore, unable to be numbered. But he had no children, but he had the vision. So Abraham didn't stagger at the promise of God. He picked himself up. He started moving toward the land that God had told him to go to. One man, God gave the vision. And so Abram finally gets to the destination. He never does see the realization of what God told him. He never sees a nation filled with people. He never sees a seed or an offspring. But what he does do, he fathers a son in his old age. When he was 90 years of age, his wife was 99. He fathers a son named Isaac, which means laughter. So the promise that God had gave to Abram, who became Abraham, is now passed on to laughter, Isaac. And so now Isaac has the promise. Nor does Isaac see the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, but Isaac fathers two children himself, Jacob and Esau. And out of Isaac becomes nations. The whole Arab, Islamic world, they trace their lineage back to Isaac, back to his son Ishmael. And that's why the Arabs and the Palestinian people, they believe that they are the right heirs to the land of Israel because they believe they are the true seed of Abraham because they're descendants of his son Ishmael. But in the Jewish Christian community, we believe that the choice son was Jacob. And that Jacob is the one to whom the promise was given. So when God decides to multiply a nation, he chooses one man, a man by the name of Jacob, whose name he would later change to Israel. And Jacob and his multiple women, and God works even through his confusion. God ain't never told nobody to have two wives at no one time. He never told anybody to do that. But some folk did that, and God still was able to bless the mess they created. So Jacob, or Israel, he fathers children by no less than 4 women. He produces 12 sons. And out of his loin comes the nation. The 12 tribes of Israel come from one man, Jacob. Within his 12 sons, there was the next to the youngest son, Jacob, or Joseph. Joseph was born to him from the wife that he loved. And she died in childbirth to her youngest child, Benjamin. Joseph and Benjamin were the beloved children of their father Jacob. He showed favoritism toward them, and the other 10 brothers hated him. So God allows Joseph, Jacob's choice son, to be sold into Egyptian slavery and breaks his father's heart. But in the providence of God, God knew that a famine was going to come on the land. So when the famine comes and nations are starving to death, God chooses one man to save the entire nation, a man by the name of Joseph, who's been sold into slavery. And while he's there in slavery in Egypt, he learns all the ways of the Egyptians. He excels in politics and academics, and he becomes the second most powerful man in the nation, second only to the Pharaoh himself. And so when the famine comes, he's able to bring his father and his brothers, who even those who had betrayed him, he brought them into Egypt, and he preserved them alive. Are you following this lie? This is biblical stuff now. This ain't no put your finger in the ear and holler and scream, make a lot of noise. I'm talking about what's in the Bible, all right? And so after 430 years of being in Egypt, they started off as honored guests of Joseph at the invitation of Pharaoh, but then the Egyptians started to despise them because they became too prosperous, they became too wealthy, and the Egyptians feared they would become too politically powerful, and they were aligning themselves with the Egyptians' enemies. The Egyptians then put them in slavery. And they enslaved them for the last 220 plus years that they were in Egypt. And after 30 years in a foreign land, God said, you know what? I made a promise to Abraham. It was confirmed through Isaac. I repeated it through Jacob. It's time for me to start fulfilling that promise. So while they were slaves in Egypt, God raises up one man who had been adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, a man by the name of Moses, who had been trained in Egyptian politics and Egyptian science. And one day God speaks to Moses, and Moses comes to himself, and he realized, I am really a Jew, and these people are in slavery. They are my people. So rather than identify with the Egyptians and the power and the privilege and the prestige, I would rather choose to identify with the Jewish people. So God takes one man, gives him a revelation, a vision of the Jewish nation being liberated. And he gives them the plan to lead them out of Egyptian bondage into freedom. They go out into freedom. They go out toward the promised land. They disobeyed God at one point. So God said, now because you disobeyed me, you cannot go into the promised land. You're going to have to wander out here until this generation die. So for 40 years, they wander around in a circle out in the wilderness. And during that time, God gave them provision. Their shoes didn't wear out. Their clothes didn't wear out. God took care of them. He let the older generation who wouldn't believe him, who wouldn't trust his word, he said, you don't have a vision, you can't believe me, you can't go in and get the promise. They died, and their carcasses were bleached by the sun in the wilderness. When it came time for them to go into the promised land, God chose one man, a man by the name of Jehoshua, which means Jehovah saves. And God gave Joshua the plan, he gave him the vision, he gave him the strategy as how he would become the greatest military genius in the history of the planet, how he would take a bunch of ragtag